what if Russia had won the Cold War? So, despite some general American rhetoric, nobody actually won the Cold War. Ronald Reagan rightfully never claimed to have beaten the Soviet Union because it simply would not have been true. The failure of the USSR was not a result of American intervention. It was a steady decline as a result of bad decision making from the communists at home and abroad. As Mikhail Gorbachev became the 8th and final leader of the Soviet Union, he realized that the Soviets' problematic invasion of Afghanistan, as well as an ever-growing population, left the country cash-strapped and unable to keep up with the arms race. It was this lack of funding and the slow collapse of the communist ideology that led Gorbachev and President Reagan to sign the Strategic Arms Reduction talks and sign the Immediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. But what if this hadn't happened? What if the Soviets never invaded Afghanistan or Gorbachev had not been elected? What if somehow the USSR had outmaneuvered the USA and won the Cold War? So there is two potential ways you can interpret winning. The first being that the USSR actually launched a nuclear attack that somehow crippled America, and the second is that somehow the United States fell to communism. The latter I really cannot imagine ever happening. So if the USSR had launched a nuclear missile at the United States, either pre the Star Wars defense system or it had somehow got around strategic defense, you can rest assured that all hell would have broken loose, which is why neither the States or the USSR ever resorted to it. At this point, the Cold War would have ceased to be Cold War and would have been considered Hot War. During Hot War, we may have seen many atrocities like Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but on even bigger scales. If this had happened and somehow the Soviet managed to get the States to surrender, it wouldn't have been without a fight, which probably would have meant social and economic ruin for both countries. Wars are damaging and expensive, and Russia was already struggling to feed its people. Again, I cannot stress how bad Hot War would have been. The United States, at peak stockpile, had over 31,000 nuclear warheads in the Cold War, and Russia had close to 40,000. Both countries had a policy of mutually assured destruction in place, meaning even if there was a victor, it would have been a thin victory that would not offset the overwhelming loss. Literally. Hundreds of millions of people would have died and crop growing potential would have been destroyed for at least a decade to come. Had China stayed out of things, it would have been an opportunity for their country to assure economic dominance, and they would probably be the main world power today, perhaps along with a Scandinavian powerhouse. The other way in which the USSR could have won, so to speak, during the Cold War would be if America suffered an ideological breakdown and turned to communism, like good old Cuba. Things in the USSR were much worse than they were in the States, but the Cold War period of history wasn't plain sailing for America either. Deindustrialization and oil embargoes created inflation and lowered employment rates and economic growth. Also, the Vietnam War was very expensive and divisive. The McCarthy era demonized communism to the general public, but many Americans did have some communist sympathies. If the USSR had ever truly infiltrated the American mind, there would have been an ideological civil war, and some states would have attempted to succeed from the United States. For communism to thrive in the States, a complete overhaul of society and consumerism would have been needed. By the time the Cold War came around, America was firmly in the age of Coca-Cola and fast food franchises, which is very anti-communist in its ethos. I can't see a reversion back to agriculture or a unification of the workers and the creation of state ownership at this point in American history. It just isn't the ideology that the country was founded on. America has, and I dare say always will be, a beacon of capitalism, and I can only imagine that even if Russia had miraculously managed to win an ideology war with violence or even suggestion, the millions of Americans who valued their liberty would have rather died before it was taken away. So what if Russia won the Cold War? The only way I can see that having ever happened would have been an almost mutually assured destruction of both the USSR and the States. How can you begin to imagine a world where these two vast countries cease to exist? Suffice to say, it would be very, very different indeed. What if Russia invaded Alaska? Before we torpedo into this video, I just want to ask you guys to hit that thumbs up button and also let me know what you think would happen if the United States and Russia got into a row. Yeesh. Suffice to say, nobody thinks it's going to be pretty. Okay, so Russia and Alaska are divided by the Bering Strait, which is 55 miles wide at its narrowest point, meaning the United United States and Russian lands are just about visible to one another from the shores of the mainland. In the middle of the strait sits the island of Diomede and Big Diomede. The smaller of the island, Diomede, is the United States territory, and the Big Diomede is Russian land. Just 2 miles of water separate these two islands, and in the winter, hikers can even walk from one to the other. While the proximity is one thing, it is not as if Alaska is right next door to the heart of the Kremlin. The neighboring land is in a far-flung remote area of Siberia. If Russia were to start mobilizing their troops to the far east of their territory, the Americans would probably notice and likely be ready to defend an attack. When we say invade, it is very unlikely that Russia would or could annex Alaska like they did Crimea. They know that they simply couldn't capture the land, so I highly doubt that they would send over any of their active army of 1 million troops. They couldn't send over any of their 20,000 tanks either, but they could utilize their 3,800 rocket projectors and their air strength of 3,900 aircraft. But again, these days not a lot can happen without the states knowing. It just depends if the United States could mobilize its defenses faster than the Russians could get theirs to Siberia. Of course, if Russia sent any kind of missile to Alaska, the United States would respond quickly and decisively. The worst Russia could throw at Alaska would be a nuclear missile, which, depending on which of the 7,000 in their arsenal they chose, could obliterate much of the state and definitely could destroy Anchorage and harm many of its population of 298,000. But why? What would be the point? Not only does Alaska have missile defenses in place, this act of aggression would undoubtedly spark hot war between two countries embittered in a Cold War for much of their modern history. We know from previous episodes of Life's Biggest Questions that the United States and Russia both have the ability to destroy one another. In fact, we have heard Trump boast about his big red button on several occasions, and we've heard that Vladimir Putin thinks that he could destroy the states in minutes. This mutually assured destruction would be the worst case scenario to come from an Alaskan invasion, and honestly, even if nukes weren't involved, encroaching on North American soil would likely lead to World War III. Canada, who of course share a border with Alaska and the rest of the United States, would be the first to join the fray, and of course Great Britain would be there with their buds across the pond without the need of the permission from the EU. The EU of course would hope for a peaceful resolution, but if push came to shove, they would of course back the United States. Interestingly, this would mean Russia would be surrounded by enemies to the east and the west, which is never a good situation to be in. China would also look for a peaceful resolution and would perhaps try to stay out of the fray, possibly secretly pleased that its two main competitors were too focused on distracting one another and destroying one another to actually vie for economic dominance. Even if we took nukes out of the question, warfare is not the same these days. 100 years ago, Russia maybe could have talked their way into Cuban land, tried to grab Hawaii, skirted sneakily through Canada and surrounded the United States, but these days aerial surveillance has stopped the element of surprise needed to pull off that kind of land attack, and aerial attacks mean that land strategy is no longer a valid war winner anyway. So what if Russia invaded Alaska? It would be a huge, messy, costly mistake that at best would spark decades of suffering and at worst would destroy swathes of the modern world as we know it. What if Russia invaded Europe? Vladimir Putin makes a decision to invade Europe. Big mistake, right? Well, most likely, but before we get into the doom, gloom and booms, let's have a look at who might be drawn into the fray if Russia did push west. So at the moment, the EU consists of Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Republic of Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the UK. Wow. Now we will get to the UK last as we know, it's pretty complicated. Primed and prepped for conflict, the key players here would be France, Germany, and Italy, who are all major military nations. We can assume that the rest of the EU member nations would support a response, drawing them into the fray. Now the key nations here, outside of the big guns, are the border nations to Russia, so Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These would be key military zones. I can only assume, despite a more neutral leaning in the past, that Finland would join the fight and be another key nation. And of course, there would be Sweden, who would likely call for a peaceful resolution, but would be obligated to defend the EU. Of the non-member nations, I can only imagine the Ukraine would be first in line to join the fight against Russia, given the history. Turkey would also be a very key player and a great country to have on the side of the EU. Turkey borders Asia and Europe and is the first access into Bulgaria and the West. Turkey wants to join the EU at the moment, and although the path has been a bit rocky, they would likely be granted access if they helped fight this war. So, what about the UK? After Brexit, would the UK join the fight against Russia? Of course they would. Despite leaving the European Union, the UK is still part of Europe geographically, and its neighbours are its allies. The UK would be a very key addition too. Not only does it have a fantastic naval fleet, it also has nuclear weapons, although we're gonna save nukes for later in this video. Now for Team America World Police. Would they get involved? Of course they would. Europe and the US are allies, and also Russia has loads of oil, so you know. What about Russia then? Would they go it alone? It is likely that China would call for peace without wanting to lay all of its cards on the table just yet. China probably has more sense than to fight Europe, although I do wonder what with the rest of the world distracted, who would be watching North Korea? Where would Saudi and the Middle East stand in the conflict? While an allied Europe and Russia could in theory be an equal match, or a match that Europe would win if the States joined, I wonder if Russia may have an advantage of being one centrally organized superpower against a collection of other countries who need to work together for victory. Perhaps it would try and divide and conquer. So if we're literally talking a land invasion, then I assume it would start with Russia breaching further into the Ukraine or playing about at its borders. Assuming all NATO talks and calls for peace broke down, I assume that Russia would split their military personnel of 1 million soldiers and lead invasions through the Ukraine and Poland, with soldiers surrounding the rest of their western borders, especially Azerbaijan and Georgia if Turkey were on the side of the Europeans. Geographically, issues like the Polish forest and the European Alps would make a full sweep nigh on impossible, but the Russians could gain some traction. The Russian and European military are quite evenly matched, with Europe having a slight upper hand. Europe have a high defense budget and a bigger air force, a greater naval presence, and equally impressive tanks. This is without Americans' assistance too. But do you know what Russia does have? Nukes. That's right, if we are no longer talking a land invasion and we are now in the business of discussing nuclear weaponry, then Russia, as Putin has boasted on many an occasion, can destroy all of its neighbours at the drop of a hat. With the combined nuclear force of France and the United Kingdom, Europe has under 600 nukes. Russia, on the other hand, has over 7,000, including the biggest nuclear weapon known to man, the Tsar bomber, which could obliterate an area the size of central London, or Berlin, or Paris. With the United States involved, then the fight is in Europe's favour again. But does anybody win when things turn nuclear? I am sure that the world would avoid it at all costs, but if it did happen, millions would die and millions more would get sick from the nuclear fallout, and what's the point really? Let's not forget that Russia has actually invaded Europe. In 2014, Russia invaded the Ukraine and the West didn't do too much about it. NATO did send forces to the neighbouring countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland, signifying that any further aggression would be met with military force. But perhaps Russia would be sneaky. Perhaps they would invade Europe bit by bit, although why would they need to with the landmass they already have? It would be nonsensical. Russia wants to remain strong and to weaken its enemies, not own their land, it has enough. More likely, Russia would try and invade Europe, so to speak, with cyber attacks and espionage.
What if Russia took over the world? For decades during the back half of the 20th century, one of the largest worries across America and many Western nations was whether the USSR, or Soviet-era Russia, would be capable of becoming the dominant superpower on the global stage and essentially be in control of the entire world. And with Russia still being a major player on the world stage in the modern day, alongside all of the hectic political developments of the last few years, there's still good reason to wonder as to what a Russian-controlled future looks like. Now, the idea of taking over the world is a much different concept than it even would have been during the Cold War compared to the modern era, let alone the start of the Russian Empire and legacy hundreds of years ago. Whereas in the past, Russia's goal was likely to convert as many countries as possible to the ideology of communism, thus giving them a connection with which to convert those countries into an easily controlled allied state, having a system where there are that many spread out subjects or citizens under your direct control likely wouldn't end well in the 21st century. The easy access to the internet that most developed nations now enjoy would make subjugating a group of citizens that large incredibly difficult, as they would still have easy means of communicating with both each other and easy access to outside information, which would heavily impact the effectiveness of any necessary propaganda that Russia would need to keep their new citizens believing their new Russian leadership was for the best. Whereas a conquered country in the past could have its access to outside information or independent sources practically nullified, that's a lot harder to do when there's millions of cell phones and active internet connections in the countries you're trying to take over. Trying to keep American citizens from rebelling against Russian rule whenever Russia is over 5,000 miles away would be difficult even without the internet, but put a phone in every American citizen's hands and you've suddenly got a lot harder populace to keep subjugated. But let's say that Russia was willing to put up with all of these difficulties and issues with having a singular global superpower in the 21st century. How would they actually go about taking over the world in the first place? There are two possible approaches that Russia could take, either deciding to take things slow or a quick and crippling surprise attack. The slow approach would merely be an extension of the policies that Russia already seems to have in place, and would likely begin with more firm expansions into Ukrainian territory, as Russia has been placing forces on their border with the Ukraine recently, and has been having expansion-related issues with the country for several years at this point. We could see Russia making moves to bring Ukraine back into being part of their territory, although this would likely see a lot of pushback from other countries throughout the world. With how contentious the border between Ukraine and Russia already is, it wouldn't be long before economic sanctions were set against Russia by much of the rest of the world, beyond what the sanctions even are today. Countries with particularly strong ties to the Ukraine might even begin to send military troops to the region if Russia committed to this course of action, particularly the United States, who have voiced multiple concerns already about Russia's positioning of troops near the Ukraine border, and likely would use the scenario as an excuse to finally exert some direct military pressure on both Russia and President Vladimir Putin. And for the countries that would choose to stay out of the Russian and Ukraine conflict, they likely would begin to have second thoughts if Russia began to invade another neighboring country and showed a commitment to expansion beyond just the Ukraine. This means that a slow and steady approach for Russia just wouldn't work. There's too many countries with their own interests for them to just allow a slow takeover by Russia of the rest of Europe, unlike earlier in the 20th century when communist allies may have been enough for Russia to make some expansionist movements without more resistance. Thus, Russia's most likely option would need to be a surprise attack and rapid expansion. If you already know that the United States is going to try and economically cripple you if you try and expand into Ukraine, do something to cripple them before you even make a move. The rise of cyber warfare and hacking has obviously been an area of great interest to Russia over the last few years, so this is an area that they potentially might have an advantage in if they decide to attack the United States or other countries such as China while beginning their expansion to take over the rest of the world. Russia is no longer the strongest military force on the planet, easily falling behind both the United States and China, and so sowing chaos and creating as much confusion and difficulties as possible to impede these governments and militaries from getting organized would be a solid first blow from Russia and could give them some time as they seized weaker countries and gained strongholds in locations that would be much more difficult for Russia's larger opponents to be able to liberate and set free from Russian control. One thing we can be sure of, no matter how Russia goes about trying to take over the world, is that nuclear weapons should absolutely not be involved. They just carry far too great of a risk for every country involved. If Russia attempted to use some of their nuclear armory to initiate a surprise attack against America, China, or even a small European nation, every other nuclear-capable state on the entire planet would instantly be on high alert, with a very real chance of atomic retaliation. Using a nuclear weapon on a populated location would be an instant dismissal of decades of military common sense, and would make any remaining countries with nuclear arms very reluctant to concede with Russia, likely causing a response of their own. This was the whole reasoning behind the coldness of the Cold War in the first place. Neither side wanted to be the first to use nuclear arms against the other because it would likely lead to mutually assured destruction, as both sides would be forced to unleash their salvos of stored nuclear weapons. If Russia was expanding at a rate where their intent was literally taking over the world, and they were willing to use nuclear arms to accomplish that goal, there would be very little preventing countries such as the United States, China, or even India from striking back directly at Russia with their own nuclear weapons in an effort to stop the rogue state before matters got even worse. If this was the case, nuclear war would cause an entirely new era on Earth, and lead to a whole new host of problems for the planet to worry about, besides the already existential threat of climate change. At the end of the day, Russia taking over the world would be a huge and risky gamble by the country, but isn't a complete impossibility. While there are many mitigating factors that would hopefully prevent a Russian expansion from overtaking the entire globe, such as the many countries that would oppose them and Russia no longer being quite the military superpower that it used to be only a few decades ago, weirder things have happened throughout humanity, and who knows where the future will take us. All we can do is keep our eyes and ears open and keep asking ourselves the big questions.